Hi everyone, my name is Katie and I am one of the registered dietitians at the Grand River Community Health Center. So today I'm gonna start what I hope will be a series of cooking videos. So I figured since I'm not able to do cooking classes in the center, I would do some home cooking videos. So this is my kitchen, welcome. So that I can still share my love of creating food with you. So my plan is to hopefully over the next week or so share a couple of videos that feature legumes. And I know you're probably thinking, big surprise, the dietitian wants to talk about beans. But I promise these recipes are super tasty, and some of them you wouldn't even be able to tell that there's beans in there. So I'm highlighting lentils over the next few videos. So today I'm going to make banana lentil muffins, and I'm gonna post the recipe in the comments, so don't feel like you have to be scribbling down amounts and instructions as I go if you're wanting to make these on your own. I will include them in the comments section, the full recipe. So I picked this because, if I'm honest, I enjoy cooking, but I really love baking. So I thought, what better place to start than a baking recipe. So before I begin preparing the muffins, I did just want to talk a little bit about nutrition in terms of lentils and just a few tips and tricks. So for anyone who isn't familiar with lentils, they are a pulse. And so pulses are dried edible seeds of certain plants in the legume family. So it includes beans, dried peas, chickpeas, and lentils. And then nutrition-wise, and I do have some examples to show you in a minute, nutrition-wise, some of the great things that lentils bring is that they are a source of iron, and they have fiber, and they are a plant-based protein source. So for anyone who's seen the new Canada's Food Guide, that is one of the things that they really highlight, is trying to include more plant-based proteins in our diet. So not that you have to become vegetarian, but it's nice to kind of add that variety and switch it up from meat-based meals. So there's a couple of options when cooking and or baking with lentils. So you can use canned lentils, which is what I'm doing today. And so they are a little bit of a time saver in that they're already cooked and ready to go. You just need to rinse them off really well. So I usually use like a sieve and just rinse them really well for like a minute under running water, just to help get rid of some of the liquid that they're packed in. That's where a lot of the sodium is. So giving them a good rinse helps to cut down on the sodium content. The other option would be your dried lentils. So I have two different examples here today. We have brown lentils and we have red lentils. They're all great options. The brown lentils, they hold their shape a bit better when you're cooking with them. I really like them in like pasta sauces if I want that bit of texture, in salads. Whereas the red lentils, when you're cooking them for a while, they do tend to kind of dissolve and just sort of blend into whatever recipe. So I really like them in soups, or if you're just trying to kind of thicken a sauce but you don't necessarily want any added texture. And so those are kind of a few examples of the dried lentils. And I just find in general, because of their size, I don't know if you can see very well, they're quite small in comparison to, say, a kidney bean. So for people who aren't totally sure about pulses, I find these are a really nice way to introduce them into the diet, just because of their size. They're less obvious in dishes, and not that we need to hide them, but sometimes if people are kind of very texture sensitive, it can be a good starting point. And sometimes I'll suggest to folks even like doing like a half and half. So if you have a pasta sauce that has ground meat in it, you could sub out some of the ground meat for some lentils. And a lot of times, again, because they're so small, they kind of blend in nicely with that dish. And I also just find that lentils and legumes in general are quite versatile. You can use them in all sorts of different dishes. The recipe I'm using today is adapted from a recipe off of lentils.org. So I would definitely, if you're interested, recommend you check out that website if you have access to the internet. They do have a number of resources that go more in depth in terms of nutrition and health benefits, as well as a lot of information on how to cook with them, and all sorts of recipe ideas. So I did finally, before we start cooking, just want to mention for the dried lentils, if anyone hasn't used them before, one of the pluses to these is that in comparison to other pulses, other beans that are dry, you don't have to soak them in advance of cooking them. So the only thing I would suggest is just, again, using something like a sieve if you can, and giving them a really good rinse first to get rid of any of the like dust and debris that might be packed in with them. And then in terms of next steps, so you would put them in a pot with some liquid. So you can use water, or you could use something like a chicken broth or a vegetable broth. And so in terms of a ratio, for every 1 cup of dried lentils, you're going to use 3 cups of liquid. And then you bring that up to a boil, put a lid on the pot, so make sure you choose a pot that has a fitted lid, and then turn it down to simmer and just let it cook till it's tender. So for whole lentils like this, it's probably gonna take about 15 to 20 minutes for them to cook. And then that's it, then they're ready to go, and it would be just like using these guys here, the canned ones. Okay, so now it's time to bake. So the first step is to wash our hands really well. So this is something that if I was doing a class in person, I'm always reminding people and encouraging washing your hands frequently while you're cooking. You know, if you cough or sneeze, you touch your face or hair, you have to go to the bathroom, you're touching the trash, anything like that. Always good to wash your hands well after, before you continue cooking. So from a food safety perspective, keeping our hands nice and clean is one of the steps that we can take. It'll be hard in this shot for you to fully see what I'm doing, but the first thing for washing our hands is we're gonna turn on the sink. And we're gonna get our hands wet, and then usually to conserve water, I shut it off. I'm gonna get soap, and then I'm gonna lather really well for 20 seconds. Now you could sing happy birthday twice to yourself. While I enjoy singing, I will spare you because it's not necessarily a talent of mine. So I'm just gonna count in my head. All right, and then we're gonna turn the sink back on. Rinse them really well. And then ideally, if you can use like your arm or not directly your hands to bump the sink back off, and then either letting them air dry, letting your hands air dry, or drying with a clean towel. So hopefully you could see that the key there is really to do that lathering in between your fingers, under your nails. That lathering motion is kind of one of the most important steps for proper hand washing. So if you just put soap on your hands, rub them together a couple times and shove them under the sink, you're not really getting rid of all the germs. Okay, so I have already sort of pre-prepared some stuff for today to save time, but I always like to, when I'm cooking or baking, get as many of the ingredients out and ready for myself as I can. So you'll see some of the containers and things are already kind of laid out, ready to go. And so I just find that this helps to make sure that I have all of the ingredients that I need, because there's nothing worse than being halfway through a recipe and then realizing that you don't have a key ingredient that you absolutely need for the recipe. Now, I'm all for substitutions. I've definitely done that before, but sometimes there's certain things you just can't really make the recipe without. So by getting everything out first and making sure you have everything, you prevent yourself that headache partway through the recipe preparation. So I am going to just preheat our oven here. So these bake at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we have a muffin tin that's already sprayed and ready to go. And so there are two different mixtures that we have. So we have our dry mix. I didn't really think there was much to show you here, so I already measured this out. So this has your 1 1/3 cups of whole wheat flour, your teaspoon of baking soda, your teaspoon of baking powder. If you didn't have whole wheat flour, you could certainly do all-purpose flour or white flour. And then the original recipe actually called for raisins. If you like raisins or dried cranberries or any some sort of dried fruit, go for it. I usually substitute with 1/2 cup of chocolate chips because, I mean, my whole family loves chocolate. So that's just sort of our preference. Or you just could omit and not put either if you want, and that's fine too. So that's our dry mixture. It's already done. And then I already semi-started the wet mixture. So we have our 1/2 cup of canola oil. And again, if you don't have canola oil, vegetable oil would be fine. I would hesitate on some of the oils that have more of a flavor, like a coconut or olive oil, depending, you might not want that taste to come through in your muffins. But I would say vegetable oil and canola oil are both fairly neutral. And then we have 1/2 cup of sugar and a teaspoon of vanilla. So a couple of other things that we have to add. So it calls for a cup of mashed banana. So certainly if you have fresh banana, go ahead. I usually just use like a fork to mash. You can go ahead and use those if they're ripe enough. Usually with baked goods, the riper the better. And certainly in terms of sweetness, you get more of that flavor come through if they are riper. I typically have a stock of already frozen bananas, and I usually peel them and put them in some sort of like container, just because I've had difficulty, I find, if I put them in whole, sometimes kind of defrosting them and getting that peel off becomes really messy. So that's just my personal preference, is I kind of cube them into little chunks and throw them in freezer safe containers. So certainly if you're using frozen, that is fine as well. You just want to make sure that you thaw them either in the fridge or use the microwave if you're ready to use them right then, to get them to room temperature so you can do that mashing. So a cup of mashed bananas would be roughly 3 medium bananas, I'm gonna say. But really it depends on the actual size of your bananas. So I might suggest doing like 1 at a time and seeing how much it fills up of the cup, rather than doing 3 all at once. And then if you have tons of extra, you might not have a specific purpose for it. You could freeze it already mashed and use it if you haven't frozen it before, if you're using fresh and you have extra. But yeah, I would say start small and build up until you get to the amount you need. So here is my cup of mashed bananas. So I'm gonna throw that in here. All right, and then the 2 other things we need, so we have 1 egg, so I'm gonna do that last. And then we also need a cup of lentil puree. So for the lentil puree, like I said, I'm just gonna rinse my canned lentils really well here. Okay, I already semi-rinsed them before, so that should be good. All right, so a couple of things to note here. If you have a food processor, that's great. It makes this step pretty fast. If you do not, I would still say you could do this by hand. So for the cup of mashed lentils, you're gonna want probably about 1 1/4 cups of lentils in their whole state, and then about 1/4 cup of water, just to kind of help thin it out and get it to the right consistency for that puree. So I'm just gonna, I often like to use liquid measuring cups for this kind of thing. So then I can measure out my water first, add in my lentils, and just mash them right in this container. I'm all for not having to do extra dishes when you don't have to. So that was a little bit more water than I wanted. And when you're measuring liquids, it's always good to get down to eye level, because if you're looking from higher up, it can be deceiving, and you might think that you have the right amount, and you will not. Okay. So there we go. That's about 1/4 cup of water. And then I'm just gonna measure out. My cup and a bit of the lentils. So this is gonna take a little bit more elbow grease, I'm sure. One little trick that I might suggest, and that we can try doing now just to see if it helps, would be to heat the lentils just very briefly in the microwave. Sometimes when they're a little warmed, they are a little easier to mash, I find. So my suggestion would be maybe just do like 10 seconds on kind of regular high power. All right. And so a couple of other notes just while we're waiting for that. One of the other things that I would say with just kind of cooking and baking in general, and particularly baking when you don't necessarily have to do a lot of chopping, is that you don't necessarily have to do it all standing. So you certainly can, if you have like a stepping stool or a seat or something secure that you can bring up to the counter and sit at and do your work right here, or even we have like a kitchen table off to the side there, so even having all of your ingredients set out and sitting at the table. So certainly if you're having a day where you're not feeling super high energy and you don't want to be standing for a long period of time, you have that option to kind of give you breaks or just to do the whole thing seated. So yeah, that's another beauty of baking in particular, I find. Okay, so our lentils are heated a bit. I'm gonna get a fork. And we're just gonna do a bit of mashing. Now, I would say, like, I would usually use a food processor. We do have one, and at the center, we also have one. If you have a really good blender, you might also be able to make that work. It's probably gonna take a bit more scraping and kind of pulsing or blending with it. But there are a lot of really great blenders out there that might do the job. So normally I would do that. I also don't mind if there's a little bit of like chunky bits or little bits of lentils. I'm not thrown off by that. But again, if you have any people that are maybe a little more texture sensitive or have some preconceived thoughts about pulses, then you might be better off trying to do the food processor as opposed to by hand, so that you know it's going to be a nice smooth consistency. Because honestly, then you don't notice them at all texture wise. They're just that nice little bump of fiber and protein to a muffin. So just bear with me another minute here. It's coming along pretty well. I'll show you in a second. Okay, I could probably get this smoother if I spent a really long time. But for us today, I don't think my family is gonna mind. It's not gonna be a huge deal if it's a little bit chunkier. But you can see it is kind of mostly mashed up. There are still some pieces there. Like I said, if I spent another few minutes, I could probably get this a bit smoother. But that's our puree. So we are going to measure in our cup, and then the last thing we need is an egg. So usually if a recipe doesn't specify, if it just says 1 egg, they're talking 1 large egg. This over here. And then the other piece I wanted to mention with eggs, so once you have cracked it and added it in, you want to make sure that you wash your hands really well again. And the reason for that is because eggs can contain a type of bacteria called salmonella that can cause sickness, can cause a foodborne illness and make us unwell. So generally, as long as you're cooking eggs properly and you are washing your hands well, those are really good steps to make sure that you're not going to get sick. So there's our lentils. So last step is the egg, and then the last thing we're gonna do for the batter is just, and there goes my oven, it's ready, so that's good timing. We're just gonna mix the dry into the wet, and then it'll be ready to scoop. So I'm just gonna grab my egg. So if you are worried about getting eggshell into the rest of your ingredients, you can just crack them separately into some sort of like bowl container, so that way if there is any eggshell, you can scoop it out before you dump it in with everything else, because sometimes it's hard to pick it out of a full bowl of ingredients. That one cracked pretty easily though, so I think we're gonna be okay. All right, so like I said, I'm gonna wash my hands really well. And then we'll just give the wet ingredients a really good stir and then mix them all together. Now, other key with muffins, is not to overmix the batter. So the challenge with that is that if you do that, you can get air tunnels where you get like pockets of air in spots in the muffin, or they can get kind of tough. So you want to mix it until everything's combined, but not continuing to mix and get everything really smooth. It's okay if it's a little bit chunky, depending on the recipe. You're going to expect that. There will certainly be some bits of banana that are a little chunkier that aren't fully mashed. I don't mash mine to completely smooth. And a lot of recipes have, like, you might have blueberries, might have chocolate chips, that kind of thing. So you don't need the batter to be perfectly smooth. You just want it mixed, that everything is wet and combined. Okay, so I am going to just get a fork, a fresh fork, to stir together all of my wet ingredients. So there we are. I don't want it to dump, but this is what it looks like, the wet part. And here again, I have my dry stuff. So I'm just gonna shake the dry into the wet. And then try to just kind of fold it in. It's a little easier for you to be able to see this in person, but I will do my best. So here you can see I'm starting to kind of fold it in a bit. And always making sure to really scrape the sides, because I find that flour and baking soda and all that kind of tend to stick to the side. And sometimes it's deceiving. It'll look like it's fully mixed, but if you dig a little along the bottom, you'll see that there's lumps of flour still sitting on the bottom that haven't gotten mixed in. Okay, so we look like we're good. So I'm just gonna grab my muffin tin, and then for scooping, so usually with muffins, they're gonna rise a bit, so you don't necessarily wanna fill them right to the brim, all the muffin cups. It's good to leave a little bit of space, so even if you make them like 2/3, 3/4 full, recognizing that they are gonna rise. Otherwise, if they're too big, you might get like a really big muffin top, and sometimes they kind of widen out and spread and stick to some of the other muffins beside them, depending on the pan. So leaving that little bit of space, and certainly if you end up that for whatever reason you have a bit of extra batter beyond what the recipe calls for, I think this recipe says it makes 14 muffins, so we might end up needing another tin. But you can always make them a little bit smaller and make a few extra, or you can use like the mini muffin pans and make more. I would just say then you have to cut back on the cooking time. So I'm just gonna grab my muffin pan. And I'm realizing now that I didn't pre-grease it. So you can use like a bit of just butter or margarine on like a piece of wax paper and just individually grease, or you can use a little bit of cooking spray. I would just say if you're using cooking spray, holding the pan far enough away. If you hold it too close, sometimes you get really concentrated sprays of oil. Yeah, so just personal preference, which you want to use. So there we have our pre-greased tin. And so when I am filling them, I often use a like a 1/4 cup measure. Just because this is actually 1/3 cup, sorry, a 1/4 cup or a 1/3 cup, just in terms of keeping it fairly even for filling. And I find it also is less messy sometimes than trying to like pour them or scoop with just a spoon. So I'm just gonna make a space for myself here. And then that is it really in terms of active time that you have to spend on these. And then we're just gonna pop them in the oven for about 15 to 20 minutes. Everyone's oven is gonna be a little bit different. So I would say probably err on the low end of that number. After about 15 minutes, I would start checking them every couple of minutes, because the last thing you want is burnt muffins. And so I will show you once they're done kind of a few things I look for to know that they're finished, and also recognizing that a lot of times, like once you take something out, it may still keep doing a little bit of cooking after you take it out, because it's still going to be hot, right? So sometimes even if they're just slightly underdone, they might still continue cooking for a tiny bit after. So you certainly want them to be finished, but not to the point where they're too crispy and then might end up being overcooked. And another note about the mashed banana, just while I'm sitting here thinking as I'm scooping, sometimes I find that I end up with just a little bit more than the recipe calls for. So you don't want to do tons more, because sometimes that can end up affecting the outcome, the end result of your baked product. But if you had like a cup and a few tablespoons, don't worry about saving those few tablespoons. I'm sure that the recipe would be fine with that little bit of extra. I've definitely had that little bit extra, and they just come out extra moist. If you're getting a significant amount more, even like a 1/4 cup plus extra, then you might consider saving that for another recipe, or you could throw it in a smoothie. And then same with the lentils, because I now have all this leftover. So my family uses lentils enough, I could just put these in a container in the fridge. And use them in pasta sauce or something in the next couple of days. But you could also puree up or mash up the whole can, and then with the whatever's left, it's going to be about half of it probably that's left over, a little over half the can. You could, if you have like an ice cube tray or any smaller containers, you could freeze some of the puree, and I suggest doing it in sort of smaller amounts, because then you can just use those little cubes to throw into things, throw into a smoothie. Or if you think that you're gonna like this recipe, or once you've made it, you know you like it, you could freeze the whole amount of leftover, and it would be about the right amount to make the next batch of muffins. So definitely freezing them. I like the ice cube trays or just small containers, and then using them at a later date, so that you're not wasting half a can of lentils. Okay, so technically, because it was supposed to make 14 muffins, these would have been less full if I had used an extra tin, but I'm just gonna go ahead and be a rebel and see what happens. So this is what they look like, and then in the oven they go. We'll set a timer for 15 minutes and then be checking them. Hi everyone. Okay, so they have been in the oven for 19 minutes and they are done. So this is what they look like. So one way to tell if they're cooked is to just stick a toothpick in the center of the muffin and making sure it comes out clean. Now sometimes when there's like chocolate chips, you're gonna get a bit of melted chocolate, but not wanting them to come out all gooey when you pull the toothpick out. Or yes, we have a very excited muffin taste tester right here. Or the other thing you can do is if you're able to just take them out and just being careful, they're warm, but if you press down on it, the muffin top should spring back and not indent. So that's another quick way to tell if they are cooked. So I wish I could send my batch out to you via email, but I'm afraid for today you're gonna have to settle for positive vibes from me and my well wishes, and just hoping that you all continue to stay healthy. And yeah, until next week in Katie's Kitchen, I will see you later.